Rev Don Lewis, coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Rev Don. Welcome. And I hope you're having a lovely day. As you may have noticed, our title for today's program is Community Curse. About as sensational a title as I could think of. And a bit of a sensational subject. And this program has its origin in a post made, I believe, just yesterday by Patrick McCullum. Patrick McCullum, I'm sure you know, is a prominent pagan leader who is involved with things like the UN and the international peace movement. So when he says something, people listen to it. And hello to Ravenwolf in the chat room. As you know, if you follow Midday with Rev Don, you can type your comments or questions into whatever platform you may happen to be watching on. They will appear here in my chat room, and we can talk directly. And this might be a subject in which you may have some comments. I would hope that it would be. But I do want to say, just getting off the start, hello to Janet in the chat room, that this program is going to be a lot more about questions than it is about answers. It's going to be an examination of the subject. Maybe a few things you may not have heard before, but also not just what possible answers might be or possible responses, but how we get there. I think that this is something we don't look at often enough in our community. Hello to Jan in the chat room. Hello to Lolan in the chat room. How we get to our answers. Hello to Mary in the chat room. And the place I'm going to start our discussion is going to deal with that quite specifically, and probably is not where you expect me to start unless you know me well, in which case you may not be surprised at all. Hello to Tommy in the chat room. And the place I'm going to start this discussion about whether Patrick and or other people in positions of leadership are on the receiving end of black magic of some sort is with one of my favorite bugaboos. And that is Mercury retrograde. And if you've been in this community for any length of time, that you will know that there's a certain number of people who, whenever Mercury goes into retrograde, which happens quite often, basically go hide under their beds and say, everything will go wrong now because of Mercury retrograde. And that just bugs the heck out of me for a number of reasons, one of which we're supposedly magical people. Things should not be affecting us that way. Another is, as an astrologer, I know perfectly well that is not what Mercury retrograde is about, and it's not what Mercury retrograde does. That doesn't mean Mercury retrograde is not a thing. It does not mean that it does not have effects which can be other than we might want them to be. It does mean that it's not responsible for everything that could possibly go wrong in your life during that time. It deals with things that are particularly related to Mercury. And hello to Lavola in the chat room. Now, if you've been in this community for any length of time, you probably will also have met people who, whenever anything goes wrong in their lives, start to make the assumption that someone is cursing them or hexing them or doing some sort of black magic against them, even though the things that have gone wrong in their lives are perfectly ordinary things. These are examples of intellectual laziness. It's very easy to choose this kind of thing as an effect. Now, Lolan in the chat room says, you know, this sounds like the positive magical bubble. If you think negatively, you get negativity. Well, you know, I do tend to think that particularly how we react to things is related to how we think about them. So now, Sir Ed in the chat room says, is it possible to create Schrödinger events, which could be multiple different things, but we interpret them based on what we want the outcome to be? I think that's entirely true. And I think this is a good example of how we can look at the things that happen in Mercury retrograde, for example, and how we attribute them is very much under our control. But I think that we very often put ourselves into situations where we become bound by things because we make these intellectually sloppy assumptions, which also doesn't mean that that thing that's gone wrong couldn't have been caused by Mercury retrograde if it fits the right criteria. Now, I want us to go and read what Patrick actually said. And I think this is a very good example of someone asking this question. It's in the middle of a rather long letter that talks about his ongoing projects and his ongoing health problems. And if you follow Patrick's work, you'll know he's been involved in a very large project in South America for quite a long time. And every time he starts moving forward, something happens. Something health-related happens, usually. And once again, this has happened. He is talking about one thing that has continued to hover in the background of all this is that it all started within a few days of my announcing that I would lead the project to protect the Amazon and to help protect the indigenous people there. As soon as I started the process, my knee got infected and I had to have major surgery. Then on my second journey, where I helped the Koji, the infection returned again, and once more I had to have another major surgery. Repeat, 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 5 times now. Friends and elders have been suggesting for some time now that I might be under some kind of psychic attack, or that perhaps the people or forces that are profiting from the destruction of the Amazon may be sending negative energy my way to stop me. They have been openly killing indigenous elders in the Amazon since we started, whenever they try to save the land, and so they would have no problem doing something like that. But then he goes on to say, I cannot say that that is the case here. But since I have thousands of friends who are deeply spiritually connected, I am going to see if my team at the McCullum Foundation and my indigenous brothers and sisters can organize some kind of global ritual or prayer circle to address that. So I want to say again that I think that Patrick has addressed this in the best possible way, because he's not making an assumption. He's saying this has been suggested to him. And since it is something that he would not put past the people he's dealing with, maybe it might be wise to take precautions. I think that's a very good response, a very good way of looking at it. I think far too often people just jump to a certain conclusion. One of the questions, or to be more precise, one of my reasons for addressing this were some of the answers I've seen people make. And those answers run from, well, of course, it could only be that, to, well, it couldn't possibly be that. And I don't think either of those are good answers. I think that as thinking people and as magical people, anything like this needs to be considered. And it's always good to take logical precautions. You know, if you think someone is sending you negative energy, of course you do your shielding. You should be doing that anyway. You make it a little stronger. You do the things that you learned how to do to protect yourself. If you don't, you're making a mistake. That doesn't necessarily mean that someone is necessarily sending something negative to you. It's still a wise precaution either way. Now, Ravenwolf makes an interesting point in the chat room, and I think that they are referring a little bit more back toward our retrograde comment, but also this too. To some extent, it could be focused groupthink, meaning if you focus on something having a negative reaction, you can strengthen that reaction or cause that reaction. That's one of the reasons we shouldn't be focusing on that kind of thing. Why we should be looking at it sensibly. You know, if you truly believe that every time Mercury goes retrograde, everything in your life is going to go wrong, it's a lot more likely to go wrong. And you're more likely to see it as having gone wrong, even if it didn't. We need to remember that we're both thinking creatures, influenced by our thoughts, and magical creatures. And Sir Edward asks if there are special rituals to break curses. And certainly there are. Just as there are defenses you can do, there are all kinds of things you can do. And hello to Calvin, joining us from Raleigh, North Carolina. And Mary says there's certainly plenty of people sending negative energy to Reverend Patrick, whether or not they're consciously doing it. And I believe that's absolutely true as well. And so if I were Patrick McCullum, or if I were someone like myself in the positions I've been in, or anyone in a similar position, I would be doing lots of shielding. I would be doing it even if I didn't know specifically anyone was sending me anything negative, because you know someone somewhere is. And even if I weren't someone like myself, I would be shielding on a regular basis. I think it's right there in the first lesson of the first degree of the Corellian lessons. It's something that ideally you should do frequently, daily, maybe more than once a day, depending on your circumstances, depending how you feel. It's just a sensible thing. But some people take it far more than sensibly. Some people get very paranoid when they really don't need to. And other times, there maybe needs to be paranoid. You know, I have in my lifetime been involved in multi-continental magical wars in which people did what I would consider really terrible things. When I was in Salem, there were people, certain individuals, certain warlocks of that community, doing curses against myself and people close to me very publicly, taking public credit for it. No question it was happening. And one of those people close to me died shortly after one of those ceremonies in a very unusual way. She died in a car accident. Not only the only major injury in that car accident, the only thing worse than a scratch that any of the 5 people in the accident received. But she died. Things do happen. People do things. But to automatically assume that is foolish. And Mary says shielding is like locking your doors and putting on your seatbelt. You know, I do kind of look at it that way. Lavola says it's so disheartening to hear all this. Well, you know, it is. In the magical community, a lot of us like to focus on sweetness and light, partly in the belief that what we focus on will increase in our lives. That does not mean necessarily, certainly not for myself, that I assume that that's all there is. It's just where I'd rather keep my focus. Um, and that kind of is, for me, the question I'm trying to look at here. Where we put our focus and how we deal with this kind of challenge. When I look at Sir Patrick's situation, there is no question something odd is happening. Now, Sir Patrick is in his 70s. You can't expect that there are not going to be health issues, but for this same one to show up again and again and again is kind of odd. On the other hand, he travels in some very unusual places. He could be dealing with something as simple as an infection from something that's not been identified because no one else in our Northern Hemisphere medical situations have encountered it previously. It doesn't necessarily have to be a magical situation, but it also could be. Not everyone in the world shares the idea of good karma magic. There are lots of people out there who are quite proud of the fact they don't. One of the things I commented upon yesterday is that this is not the first time, and Patrick says that people have been pointing out to him for a while that some of them think he might be on the receiving end of negative energy. This has been heavily discussed in certain segments of the pagan community this year. Approximately 10 pagan leaders, ranging from about the highest level of prominence to more local levels, have had serious health problems this year, and basically within weeks of each other, carrying out through the year. This has caused a lot of conversation behind the scenes, including people suggesting that it must be spiritual warfare of some sort. We're going to come back to that term. This was brought to me as early as March of this year. Some of those people have been prominent and public about what happened. Others have never said a word. But, and this is very important, the larger number of them are in their 60s or 70s. The idea that health problems are happening to people in their 60s and 70s, health problems you would expect for people in their 60s and 70s, isn't really a suspicious thing. It's what you expect in your 60s and 70s. That doesn't prevent some people from viewing it suspiciously, and it also doesn't mean it could not be a suspicious thing. And hello to Lynn in the chat room, and Tommy says, why do some people want to harm others? And we're probably going to go longer than 30 minutes today, because I want to look at this, but that is part of the question here. And there are different answers depending on who we're talking about. At the most simple level, there are answers like greed. If you can take something from someone rather than building your own, it's easier. Some people think that way. If for some people, it's a matter of their own spiritual beliefs. And if you follow my work, you'll know that I've been talking about Christian spiritual warfare back into the 90s, Sir Edward and I both. And several times over the years, I've brought you stories of how they very publicly talk about this campaign that they have had going for a long time of targeting those who hold different views from themselves with what we would call black magic. They, of course, call it spiritual warfare. They use terms like prayer. But if you're praying for someone to die, it's still black magic. But if you look at some of those stories, you'll see that many of the techniques they're using are magical techniques, very similar to what we might use in other more positive ways. Those people are out there doing that far back as I can remember in my life, almost. Back into the 70s, there were spiritual warfare groups praying for Supreme Court justices to die. There are a lot of people who, for their own philosophical reasons, are quite willing to practice black magic against those who they do not like, who hold different points of view, who they perceive as challenging their cultural dominance, or in some cases, their chance at cultural dominance. And I do not for one moment doubt that that is happening. One of the comments that was made yesterday, and I misunderstood the comment when it was made, but the answer was still appropriate. And that was, why would there be an attack? Now, what the commenter actually meant was what circumstance might have provoked it. But my response to that is, or was that, if you can't figure out why pagan leaders might be subject to an attack from certain quarters, your head is buried in the sand, because those quarters are very open about making those attacks. I think that anyone in a position of leadership in this community who is not aware of that possibility and does not take some acknowledgement of that possibility is a fool. Now, does that mean it's an actual problem? That's a whole other question. But to just act like it's not a thing is rather foolish. And Ravenwolf remarks on certain forms of folk magic. And what I think Ravenwolf is pointing out is that many forms of magic, other than, say, Wicca, have very different moral systems that do not prevent them from doing what we might consider bad karma things. Certainly, that segment of the Christian community that practices spiritual warfare has nothing preventing them from doing what we would consider bad karma things. They're doing it constantly. Is that perhaps what's happening with Sir Patrick? It certainly could be. And I think his answer at this point is the right one. And that is, I don't know that that's what's happening. But maybe some rituals to deter it, to counteract it, are a good choice, whether we actually are making the assumption or not. And, I think that is true. And Ravenwolf points out that Sir Chad also commented on attacks or energy. Basically this same situation in the tradition. And yes, this is the very same subject he was remarking upon. As I say, there have been rather a large number of pagan community leaders, mostly heads of large or large-ish organizations, who have had some serious health problems this year, and again, with interesting timing. And I assure you, those individuals have been talking about this. I'm not going to, again, name any of them, because none of them have suggested to me that I should do such a thing, except for myself. I was, as far as I know, the first one. And do I think that what happened to me was the result of a magical attack? And at least at this moment, my answer is no, I do not think that. I think what happened to me is completely cromulent to my health history, my previous experiences, and my age. But I also do keep open the fact that this is an assumption. And if you were to ask me, have I also done um, excess shielding and protective work that I might not otherwise have done? And the answer is yes. I certainly have. And Magical Mermaid says, lifestyle and age. Well, yes, lifestyle too. But one of the things that's always caught my attention is I've been working very hard to improve my lifestyle before the health problems occurred, but maybe too late. Um, and Ravenwolf says, you already broke the curse of your age. You said before that family members of your age had a shortened lifespan, and you beat that. I'm at the upper end of it, and that is an accomplishment. The age that I am is 1 year younger than my mother's death. 1 year younger than my aunt's death. About 5 years younger than my grandmother's death. But in my family, to be having health problems at this age is obviously a perfectly normal enough thing to be happening. So no, I do not make the assumption that there was a magical attack there. I also don't leave it out of the possibilities. I just don't make the assumption because there are far too. It goes back to Mercury retrograde. Is something that I knew was about to. If I run out of ink on my printer, and I knew that I was already about to run out of ink on the printer, Mercury goes retrograde, the ink runs out. It's not because Mercury went retrograde; it's because I didn't change the ink earlier. Lavola says that TikTok is a bit of a cesspool of witch wars and magical people hexing each other. Yeah, that I've seen a lot of that in my 50 odd years in the magical community. It was long before TikTok. It's a certain segment of the community. Sir Edward asks, does learning magic make this sort of thing more likely? I don't know what I'd say to that. I have to think about that for a moment, but it certainly makes the assumption more likely. And it also, in my opinion, causes our assumptions to take on still stronger meaning when we learn magic. Because, when you learn magic, where you put your energy causes energy to flow in that direction. If you are one of those people that Lavola was just mentioning, who's constantly thinking people are declaring magical war on them, or, for that matter, if you're one of the people constantly declaring magical war on others, you're automatically going to assume that that's what's happening, even if it isn't. You will interpret your experiences that way. And that can have an effect on your outcome, whether it's really happening or not. That's why I keep coming back to Mercury retrograde. When you assume that when Mercury goes retrograde, when you as a magical person assumes this, that everything is going to go wrong, things are a lot more likely to go wrong. Partly because you're looking for it, and also because you may be creating it. When you're looking for everybody declaring war on you, everybody hexing you and cursing you, you're a lot more likely to come to the conclusion that's happening, whether it is or not, because you'll be looking for it. You may be creating it in more ways than one. And you may be drawing that energy about yourself, because when we're magical people, where energy goes, energy flows. As magical people, we have even more control over what's around us than if we were not magical. Which is why I say that Sir Patrick has made the best answer to this situation, which is to ask people what they think and suggest the idea of taking some precautions without making an assumption. And I think that is also my point of view here. As I was saying, I do not assume that I was the recipient of a magical attack. at least not as the cause of my health problems. I have been the recipient of a number of magical attacks over the years I've been in this community by people who are quite clear in admitting they did it. And because of that, I do a lot of shielding anyway. But when I look at the situation, I also don't rule it out. So I do a little extra shielding, a little extra protection, a little extra fortressing that I might not otherwise have done, even though it's not my assumption, because I think it's only sensible to take some precautions. And so, as we look at these situations, to me, again, the most important thing we're looking at on the surface is how we react to them. And again, when I saw this post and others based on it, I saw two basic responses and a handful that I thought were more reasonable. The first who said, oh, it must absolutely be that, and the other said, oh, it couldn't possibly be that. I have to point out, as a magical person, if you believe in magic, then this is a possibility that you must acknowledge. Now, having said that it's a possibility, does that mean that it could reach the person? Well, if they're properly shielded, no, you really shouldn't be able to reach them. But here's the thing about shielding. There's an ancient saying that evil must be invited in. And we'll leave aside definitions of words for the moment. But nobody says that that's a straightforward statement. If you read The Hobbit, as many pagan people have, or watched the movie, you will know that the downfall of the dragon Smaug was it was missing a single scale on its underside. That gave a way for it to be defeated. It is, in my opinion, a physical example of how evil can be invited in a totally unconscious sort of way. The door was left open. The same with Achilles and his heel. His mother Thetis was very skillful at protecting him magically, but she didn't stop to consider the one place she missed, or if she did, she said, well, it's his heel. Who's ever going to attack him there? And sure enough, that's what took him out. So just because someone does shielding, and just because they're good at it, just because they're magically powerful, doesn't mean they may not have left an opening they're not aware of. So again, we can't just ignore the possibility. Now, Calvin says those in question of being involved in some conflict should consider working with the pentacles of Mars and maybe the pentacle of Saturn to add that extra protection from those who may want to inflict harm. That's certainly not a bad consideration. And that could lead me down a rabbit hole so quickly on the meaning of the term pentacle. I'm just going to take a moment to remind you that the term pentacle and the term pentagram are completely unrelated. A pentacle can be a pentagram, but it can be any of many other things. And the pentacle of Saturn that's remarked in the comment, if I remember correctly, it is not a pentacle, although I may be confusing it with a sigil at this moment. But if you look at the grimoires, there are all kinds of pentacles. There are all kinds of different kinds of shielding you can do. So I'm certainly not saying that's not something you might wish to consider. Even just strengthening your normal protections would be a good thing. Now, coming back to the central question, however, now Janet says, I look at retrograde as a good thing because it's like looking back on something important that I may have missed. And I think that's what retrograde is really about. It's about finding your problems and correcting them, not hiding under the bed to try to get away from them. It's very much like a Saturn return. Saturn return will put you where you're supposed to be, easily if you cooperate with it, difficult if you don't. But in the end, it addresses the problems. But coming back to the question of whether or not there is an attack against Sir Patrick McCullum, the Reverend, I believe the Right Reverend Sir Patrick McCullum, if there is an attack against a variety of leaders in the pagan community. Is there? I'm not going to say yes. Could there be? Well, obviously. In fact, actually, let me step back a moment. Is there an attack on many leaders of the pagan community? Absolutely. We know that. Christian prayer warriors have made that very clear. Could it be hitting? I'm not going to say that. The fact that a number of 60 and 70-year-old people have 60 and 70-year-old health problems could be purely coincidental. But having said that, does it make sense for us to take precautions? Does it make sense for us to do extra shielding? Does it make sense for us to do extra protection for ourselves and for our community? Yes, absolutely it does. To some extent, I'd say, what kind of magical people are we if we don't? So what I would recommend is to continue to pay attention to this situation, because I believe that there will presently be one or more ceremonies intended to enact protection, and I would encourage you to take part in it. I certainly will be. You may want to do some on your own. I have been. I think that we are being very foolish not to consider that. Now, Lovan in the chat room says, but magical or not, you are not addressing the individual versus the group. Even if the individual is morally correct, can he stand alone against the negative will of the group? And there are a couple of different answers to that, because that's a deep question. And my answer is, to some extent. When we look at the end of ancient paganism and the coming of the Christian age, obviously the answer is no. There were plenty of people who did not want to take that journey, but they could not stop it. On the other hand, as individuals, their lives may have been unchanged. So also, yes. Now, Reverend Kate says, we need to address this reasonably. And your suggestions have been valuable. Thank you, Kate. And Calvin says, pentacles relate to celestial magic and draw the influence of stars and planets. And they come from the grimoire traditions. They're quite ancient, and they're certainly not a bad thing to use. They're one of many possible things to use. Doing protection can rely heavily on visualization. It can rely on using things like pentacles, candles, etc. Any number of things you can do. I don't know that it matters what you do, although I do think that some group rituals are going to be a good idea. I do think that it's a good idea for us to consider this as a wise moment to do something. And, you know, going back to what Lolan said, when we look at the move from ancient paganism to the coming of Christianity and then Islam and the fall of the pagan world, Can one individual stand against a large group? And certainly not in a way that's going to save society. Maybe for themselves, maybe not. There does come, I think, a point where you're facing a lot to deal with. But I do believe that certain individuals um, can stand against very large numbers of groupthink for their own lives. But we're talking about our community at this moment. And I think that we really need to kind of stand together. Now, hello to Jeffrey in the chat room. Good to see you, Jeffrey. And Jeffrey says, I practice a variety of forms of shielding. Two of my preferred forms are mirroring it back by releasing the entity and sending it back to where it was sent from. Those entities seem quite happy to be released and returned to their origin. The second is transmuting the energy to my own use, such as money spells. Their loss is my benefit. I view it as a form of karma. Those are two perfectly good forms of shielding, to send back whatever negative thing may be sent against you, or to transmute it. Transmuting can be very effective and is one of the techniques I use quite a bit. But I do think that it is wise of us to be aware of the society we're living in, to be aware of the vastly increased influence of fear and hate in society. Now, those of you who follow my work and my tradition know that since 2015, we have had the peace campaign going forward, whose sole purpose was to fight against the spread of the energies of hate and fear and replace them with energies of peace and love. And if you look at the world today, you might reasonably say, well, that wasn't a very successful campaign, was it? Except we don't know that. We don't know where we'd be if we hadn't done it. Hate and fear seem to have spread far beyond what anyone of my generation ever imagined was coming. Now, Tommy says, what is transmuting? That's where you change the nature of the energy. And an example is if you take negative energy and fill it with transmuting light to raise its vibration and make it into positive energy. That's a very simple example of transmuting. Any energy can be transmuted from where it begins to some other purpose. The energy itself is still the same. It's the purpose you're changing. When you cleanse a space, that's basically what you're doing. You're removing certain parts of that energy and then transmuting the rest into a positive expression. At least that's the way that I do space cleansings. So these are my thoughts on this matter. I think that we must remember Smog the dragon and that exposed place on his chest, which let the arrow in. And not be filled with hubris in thinking that our shielding can keep anything out anytime. We also must not be filled with hubris in thinking that people are just waiting to get us, who may have no idea we even exist. We need to be cautious. But, as Mary said, shielding is locking your door and fastening your seatbelt. That doesn't mean that you're expecting to be hit by another car. It means you're taking the necessary precautions just in case it happens. And so I think that as a community, we really should be looking at that at this time. We know that Christian prayer warriors are a big thing. We can see this in the news regularly. Just yesterday, I saw someone, the same day this post from Sir Patrick came out, I saw someone commenting on a post they had seen that brought back memories of the Satanic Panic from the late 80s and 90s, which was basically an expression of spiritual warfare. We know there are people who have no good intention for our community. We know that there are plenty of them outside of our community, particularly in certain sorts of Christianity, but not exclusively. We also know there are some of them inside of our community, depending on how broad we define our community. So I'm basically saying that to do some protection for the community and the good people in it is probably not a bad idea. Even if you don't necessarily believe that there's an organized attack. And obviously even more if you do. I don't have an answer for that other than what I've given. But what I would be interested in seeing is seeing people sharing their notes. I would love to see some of those other pagan leaders who have either directly themselves expressed to me that they felt they were victims of a psychic attack, or who know that it's been said about them and what they think about this in a more public way. Because if we don't share our notes, we're not going to do much of a coordinated reaction. I think a coordinated reaction is not a bad idea. Even though, as I say, for myself and perhaps everyone involved here, I'm not assuming there's an attack. But you don't have to have an attack to benefit from shielding. You can have, can be perfectly ordinary things that you're shielding yourself from. So I think it's a good idea. With that, I think that we probably have come to all that we really need to say about this subject. I want to thank you for joining me. Next week, on Monday, we're going to have a best of program. And then the rest of the week, we're going to be talking about Corellian ancestors individually. So I hope you'll join me for that. I hope you have a lovely week. And until next time, let us have our prayer. And then we shall say goodbye for the day. And Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do in our lives. We're very grateful for your presence. We're very grateful for your guidance. And we ask you to guide us in dealing with this situation to reasonable and helpful behaviors. Help us to do whatever is needed and to avoid whatever would be unhelpful. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for this and all that you do in our lives, and knowing you are always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always.